Gospels come at the beginning of the New Testament, but the Gospels are not the first things that were written in the New Testament. In fact, most of the New Testament as we have it was written before the Gospels were written down. And so that's an instructive thing as well as we think about how the teachings of Jesus and the teaching about Jesus and how the movement that grew up around Jesus, how it took shape in that first 100 years after the life and ministry and the death and the resurrection of Jesus the Christ. And so that's what we're going to be looking at, and I'm going to create a little timeline for you as we move through this so that you can see it as well as hear me talk about it, and maybe that will help put all of this in perspective. The first thing is Jesus himself. Jesus is born sometime between 3 and 6 of the Common Era, or what we used to call AD. The reason it wasn't 0 is because when they counted it back from the Middle Ages, they miscounted a little bit. Somewhere between 3 and 6 of the Common Era, Jesus is born. And he lives, it seems, 33 years. And so that puts us somewhere between 36 and 39 of the Common Era, where Jesus' life is ended in crucifixion. We are told in all the Gospels that his public ministry lasted about 3 years. And so the Gospels don't tell us anything at all, or very little, about what happened with Jesus before he began his public ministry. Matthew tells us a little bit about his mom and dad and that they fled to Egypt, and Luke gives us a little bit more about mom and all the things that led up, and then we get that one story about Jesus being 12 years old and in the temple. But that's not a lot of stuff to tell you about 30 years of life. And so the Gospels don't shed much light on Jesus' life before he became a public figure. They pick up his story when he becomes a public minister. All of them agree that it happened around the ministry of John the Baptist, and that John the Baptist was there to point the way to Jesus. And so that's when Jesus' public ministry begins, about the time of John the Baptizer, and it goes for 3 years or so until it's ended in crucifixion. So on our timeline, the first thing we do is we make a place that marks Jesus. And I'm going to do my best for that to draw a manger with a star over it. That will stand for Jesus' birth. All of the Gospels agree that Jesus was crucified. And that crucifixion was a momentous occasion. It had significance not only for Jesus, obviously, and his family, not only for his followers, but the Gospels contend that that crucifixion had significance for the entire cosmos, for everything that was made. Jesus' death on the cross is perhaps the central teaching of the early church up until now. And so to signify that event in Jesus' life, which happened somewhere between 36 and 39 AD, it's hard to date precisely, I'm going to draw a cross. And so we go from a manger to a cross. Now it gets tricky. The event called the resurrection occurs. The resurrection is a unique event. Even today, it happens that people clinically die and then come back to life. There's a whole group of stories that have grown up around people who have had near-death experiences, or they have died and gone to the other side and come back, and they've seen a great light, or they've seen the faces of loved ones and they've come back. Those experiences happen even now. They have happened all throughout human history, no doubt, and they happened in the time of Jesus. Jesus himself raised the dead, and there are several stories in the Gospels of Jesus acting with the power of the kingdom of God to raise a dead person back to life. Perhaps the story of the little girl that's told is one of those stories. Perhaps the story of Lazarus is another one of those very powerful stories. You can pick which one of those that you like and say, oh, that's more powerful, that's more powerful. the fact is that the Gospels say Jesus had power over life and death, and that part of his ministry included not only healing and restoring people to wholeness, but it also included from time to time the raising of the dead. But all of those instances, when Jesus raised people from the dead, when people have near-death experiences and come back to life, when people seem to have died and they come back and they have stories of the beyond, all of those things are not what happened to Jesus. Jesus was not resuscitated. Jesus was resurrected. And in his resurrected appearances, Jesus is able to appear as though he is like he was before, except bearing the marks of his crucifixion. But Jesus is also able to appear and disappear in the midst of locked rooms. He is able to cloud the vision of those who are with him so that he can walk 6 miles from Jerusalem to the village of Emmaus with friends, and they don't recognize him until he wants them to. Jesus is able to communicate and teach his followers, and yet he isn't continually with them. He comes and goes. So whatever the resurrected appearances of Jesus tell us about what resurrection is, one of the things they tell us is that it's in continuity with the lives we live here and now, but that it is some kind of other life. Jesus is recognizable as who he was, but he is more and different than who he was as well. Jesus walking in Galilee and teaching and preaching couldn't pop in and out of closed rooms, but the resurrected Christ does that. And so whatever it is that the resurrection is, it's a unique thing that happened, and it's happened only to Jesus, although we are promised that it will happen to us as well. And so I'm just going to draw kind of a cloud to represent that, because even though our faith tells us that it happened, we don't know exactly what it was.